All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Willie Goldsmith. I'm a senior associate with the LenFest Ocean Program. And for those of you that don't know us, LenFest is a grant-making program that funds research projects and expert working groups to address priority science needs facing ocean and coastal decision makers. And to learn more, you can visit us at lenfestocean.org, where you can also sign up for our newsletter. And also, please feel free to follow us at LenFestOcean on Twitter. And for today, we're thrilled to have Dr. Andrew Pershing, who is the Chief Scientific Officer at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and several of his colleagues from GMRI. And they'll be introducing a new study that aims to inform ongoing deliberations regarding fishery allocation as stocks shift due to climate change. And as many of you on the webinar know, this has really been a hot-button issue in recent years, both here in the U.S. and internationally, as managers work to balance historic access with emerging fisheries. So in this project, the team is first going to review the various strategies that have been used around the world to address this challenge with the goal of developing allocation guidance for shifting stocks here on the U.S. East Coast. And they're going to be actively involving managers and stakeholders through an advisory body to ensure that the project's results can be readily considered for management strategies. And before I turn it over to Dr. Pershing and his colleagues, I just want to go over a few quick logistical items. First off, as some of you may have noticed, we have all attendees muted. This is just because this has been a very popular webinar. We have a lot of people on the line, and I just want to prevent any feedback or echoes from occurring. And after the presentation, we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes for questions about the project. And to ask a question, you can just use the Q&A panel to type and submit your question at any point during the webinar. And we'll keep track of the queue, and I'll read the questions aloud at the end for the research team to answer. And I also want to mention that while the intention is, of course, for this work to inform the dialogue around allocation decisions, we'd like today's questions to be more focused on the research project itself that Dr. Pershing and his colleagues are conducting. And depending on how many questions there are, we may not get to all of them, but folks are certainly welcome to reach out and follow up with us here at LenFest or with Dr. Pershing. And please, we encourage you really to stay in touch and to continue this dialogue. And just so you know, we are recording this webinar if any of your colleagues were not able to attend. And in the next couple of weeks, we will make the webinar recording with the video of the PowerPoint available online. And I'll be distributing that link by email. And I do have a running distribution list for information about this project. And if you're not on that list, or if you're not sure if you're on that list, please feel free to send me an email, and I will be sure to get you on there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Andrew Pershing. Andy, I'm going to be passing presenter privileges over to you now.
Okay, hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So just a second while we get the sharing set up. Okay, LenFest, can you just confirm that you're seeing the slides?
Yes, we are.
Okay. All right, thanks everybody. I appreciate it's great to see so many people logged in on this webinar. We're really excited to get this project kicked off. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview at a high level about what this, to go over kind of what this project is about, what we're hoping to achieve, and then Kanai Tokunaga is going to do a bit of a deeper dive on some of the work that we've started already. So as most of you, I imagine, know who've been working in fisheries, that history just comes up in all sorts of ways when you think about how fisheries get prosecuted and managed. Stock assessments rely on historical data and often take a backwards-looking view of a fishery. The infrastructure and the markets necessary to get products from the ocean and to market are based in places where fish have historically been caught. And of course, who gets to fish, for what species, where, and when, those often have an historical tie, and that's the allocation problem that we're going to be dealing with in this, in our study. But one of the challenges is that climate change makes history unreliable. So as we're looking at an ocean that is starting to move fish across the map, we're starting to see stresses appear in many of these places where history has played such an important guide for developing fisheries in the past. So just another way of just to bring home this point, this is a figure that Kathy Mills and Andrew Allen from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute put together, just showing the projected distribution of summer flounder, which is a species that we know is expanding northward in the northeast U.S. as waters are warming. So species are moving away from traditional fishing areas and into these new areas, and that creates the potential for climate stress as they cross boundaries, as they move into these new areas. And so this problem of understanding how fish change and how that's going to impact the management system, and specifically how it's going to impact this allocation system, it's a multidisciplinary problem, and it's a really thorny one. And so we've put together a rather diverse team to address this problem. So my name's Andy. I'm the oceanographer and the climate scientist on this project, and also serving as the lead PI.
Hi, I'm Lisa Kerr, one of the research scientists on the project. I'm here at GMRI, and my focus has been on fisheries science, particularly understanding questions of stock structure and climate and fisheries research. And I also serve in advisor capacity to address fisheries management questions.
And hi, I'm Kanai Tokunaga, and I'm a resource economist, and I'll be looking at the cases from all over the world.
And I'm Jonathan Lavery, and I run GMRI's community program, where we do a lot of work engaging with the fishing industry up and down around New England.
So our project has 3 key elements. So the first thing we're planning to do is just do a large-scale, broad policy review and trying to come up with a typology for how fishing rights have been are traditionally allocated in different fisheries all over the world. So we're calling this a typology and trying to think of different ways that you can go about classifying or characterizing these allocation schemes. We're then planning to use this typology to categorize the different fisheries around the world, and then think about how the position in this typology predisposes you to particular kinds of climate stress or side effects. So we're specifically thinking about the impact, the conservation challenges, scientific challenges, economic challenges, as well as social side effects that might occur as stocks begin to shift from one region to another. And then an important part of our project is trying to use the opportunity that we're closely aligned with the fisheries here in the Northeast. We have a lot of partners in the region, and trying to use our connections to I guess, test market a little bit, or almost focus group some of the ideas that we're pulling in from around the world, and seeing how they might apply in this region. And a key thing is that we're not recommending policies. We're not trying to develop solutions for a particular fishery. We're really trying to develop a broad toolkit that would allow fisheries anywhere in the world to start to think about as they're considering how they might want to change the management of their fishery, what they could do to perhaps mitigate some of the climate stresses. So a few of the products, we're planning to produce at least 2 synthesis papers. These will be primarily academic publications. But then we're also going to develop a high-level summary of allocation schemes and the climate stress points and side effects. And then we'll be test marketing that with the community here in the Northeast.
Yeah, so this is Jonathan. I just quickly talk about the advisory panel that we're pulling together. We are still in the process of doing that, but we've got quite a bit of interest from the 3 councils along the East Coast. As Willie mentioned, this has been a hot button issue. They're beginning to address this individually, but also collectively. And so we're really making sure that as we reach out and get more members of this advisory panel, particularly industry members, we want to make sure that we're clear on the issues that we're going to be bringing forward. As we've got a lot of interest from industry, but they want to be a little bit more clear about what we're actually, to Andy's point about whether we're making recommendations or presenting alternatives and whatnot. So we're pretty close to finalizing this team, but we're still just working on the final touches.
So now we're going to shift gears a little bit. That was a high-level overview of the project, and I hope we'll get some good questions just about the structure of the project I'm going to now turn things over to Kanai, who's going to give more of a deeper dive to give a little bit of a flavor of the way that we're planning to do this work. And we're very much in the early days for this, and so we would certainly welcome feedback around different kinds of fisheries we might look into, and also if there are different approaches that, that people can think of that, we would certainly welcome that as well.
All right, so this is Kanai, and before I start going through the cases today, I'd like to remind you that allocation of harvest takes place at different stages of management. The stock is often shared by multiple management areas, and management areas can be countries' EEZ or can be more regional, like we see in the case of the Regional Fisheries Management Council in the United States. The stock often has to be first allocated across multiple management areas, then each management body allocates the share among its fishery participants. The shares could be allocated to individual fishers or gear groups, or they may be allocated to fishing communities. And another thing that I'd like to point out is that in this project, we are reviewing different kinds of allocation mechanisms around the world. We are looking at both international fisheries and fisheries that take place strictly within an EEZ of a single country. Legal context might be somewhat different between international fisheries and domestic fisheries, but there are implications that we can draw from and apply to one another. So today, I'll go over these three examples that you're seeing on the bottom. So let's first look at a bilateral agreement between EU and Norway. So under this bilateral agreement, multiple stocks are jointly managed, and the two countries set, or two parties set TAC for each stock based on ICES advice. The jointly set TAC is first allocated between the two parties based on what's called zonal attachment. Zonal attachment, under this scheme, the stock is allocated between the two parties based on the estimated abundance of the stock in each party's EEZ. For the most part, the share between the two parties follow what's determined back when the agreement was formed, and it has not since been revised. For the EU, following the common fishery policy, its share is allocated to its member states based on relative stability key, or this is relative stability key is based on the historical catch of the member states, and each member state then allocates its shares to their own fleets. In Norway, the share is first allocated among various vessels or gear groups, and then the quota is allocated to individual vessels in a form of individual vessel quotas. The important thing here is that the shares determined by zonal attachment or relative stability key has not been really updated for many years. So history really is playing a significant role here. And as we are all aware, the stock is quite dynamic, but the allocation key has been static for many, many years. But having said that, there is a mechanism called Quota Exchange under this bilateral agreement framework. This Quota Exchange enables the two parties to negotiate annually to trade some of their quota shares across different stocks. So really, the multi-stock nature of this agreement is adding some flexibility to reflect some of the dynamic nature of the stock and also the industry needs. Now, we're also curious about how market-based mechanisms like ITQ would respond to climate change stresses. And if you look at the case of New Zealand and Iceland, they're early adopters of ITQ, and a number of stocks are managed under ITQ. And both countries use historical catch as the basis for determining quota allocations. Although both countries are similar in the way that they use the same management, there are some differences. For instance, in New Zealand, quota can be owned by any citizens. On the other hand, Icelandic quota can only be owned by fishing vessel owners. So if you look at the climate change stress, there's a possibility that climate change impact can be felt at community level quite differently between the two countries. Another thing is that the previous studies are indicating that climate change will increase a number of stocks shared internationally in Iceland. At the same time, New Zealand has a large EEZ that covers a large latitudinal range. So the stock shifts within the EEZ could make current quota allocation across different quota management areas in New Zealand obsolete. And misreporting and discarding has already been considered serious issues in New Zealand, and climate change can exacerbate that kind of problems as well. And range shifts are already showing up as a serious challenge in some fisheries, and perhaps Northeast Atlantic mackerel fishery is the most famous example. Up until the late 2000s, North Atlantic mackerel stock was shared pretty much by EU and Norway alone, but in the late 2000s, the stock distribution shifted to Northwest, and this led countries like Iceland, Faroe Islands, and Greenland to start harvesting the stock. So with these countries entering in this fishery, a cooperative management between EU and Norway has no longer been sufficient to manage the stock. And without an agreement by all fisheries participants in this fishery, the total TAC has been exceeding the scientific advice by ICES. And if you look at this from Icelandic perspective, Northeast Atlantic mackerel has become an important commercial stock. So the question is this change permanent? What is driving this range shift? Or where's the spawning ground? These ecological questions are really relevant when we're thinking about their incentives towards joint management. And these things also matter when we think about what constitutes a fair allocation. And these things matter at the end when we think about economic and biological sustainability of the stock. So we are looking at different kinds of cases and allocation mechanisms to help us better understand the impacts of climate change. And what we want to do is to look at different cases in a systematic way. As Andy talked earlier, we're trying to do this in a way that makes sense and it can be applied to different cases. So for instance, if we use these two axes, so the horizontal axis is showing the ability of fishermen to move to follow their target species, and vertical axis is showing whether the allocation share is fixed or can be changed dynamically as the stock situation changes. In the case of EU and Norway's joint management, fishermen cannot really move around completely freely, but the bilateral agreement allows each party's fleet to access each party's waters. This gives them mobility. And looking at the vertical axis, although the allocation share is fixed based on the zonal attachment, quota exchange mechanism allows some flexibility. So this kind of plots EU and Norway's joint agreement in the third quadrant, as you're seeing here. But within the EZ, relative stability key is more so set and fixed, and this puts EU somewhere perhaps close to a situation that we see in summer flounder fishery in the United States. So to sum up, we're developing a typology and classification scheme as we speak, and to guide us through different cases logically, so we can examine how different management systems respond to climate change and understand possible side effects of different allocation mechanisms under climate change.
And so this is going to be a big part of the work that we're going to do within the first year of this project, and that's really trying to fill out these axes, and also consider whether there are other dimensions that we want to use as part of our typology, and start to think through which of them are going to be most informative for trying to understand and predict climate stress. So in year one, we're working really hard on building our case studies, on developing this typology. This is going to be primarily done through literature review, although we will be trying to do some targeted interviews with participants in some fisheries, especially if they're interested in things that haven't been documented in the literature yet. We've also put together a survey, and LenFest will help us distribute this through the participant email list after, as well, where you, if there's something that, that you have that you'd like to share that you think might make for a good case study for this project, this is a structured way for you to provide that information to us. Then in the second year, we're going to think more about specifically about the climate stress points and side effects and how that maps onto the allocation typologies. And then in year 3, that's where we're really going to transition into working with the fishing industry and the fishery management bodies on the east coast of the U.S. And trying to bring some of the information that we've found from this international review and try and understand, which of the things that resonate with the stakeholders in this region. And I believe that that ends our presentation, and I'm going to turn control back over to Willie if I can figure out how to do that. So,
All right. Thank you so much, Andy and team, for that wonderful presentation, introducing us to or introducing everyone to the project. Very much appreciate it. I'll give you 1 second here as I bring up one final slide from us. All right. Well, thank you all again. And just as a reminder about the survey that Dr. Pershing mentioned, the bit.ly link that you can see on this page here is a great place to share any information that you might have in terms of other allocation issues that you've experienced that you're aware of that you could let us know about. Okay. We're now going to move into some of the questions that folks have been submitting. The first question is, are you going to look at the different ways that Maori within New Zealand allocate within those groups?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that's a really, interesting question. Yes, I think so. We are originally looking at a New Zealand case to really see how their ITQ system works. But I think what we're interested in is the details of those interesting cases, and that would also mean that looking at how Maori allocates their quotas among themselves, or how they're traded, and then how that's impacting fishing communities.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we're really interested in with the New Zealand test case is just the flexibility that's kind of inherent in some of these ITQ systems, where where quota and access can sort of move to follow the fish in an efficient way, but where you may create some different kind of social side effects potentially. I'm not so much thinking of the New Zealand case, but in other cases where you may get actually disassociation from the fishery, where people who have rights to fish are leasing them out and are no longer participating, which we would sort of classify that as a side effect.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Our next question is just a logistical one, and just checking with the GMRI folks. Would these slides be available after the webinar today for folks to access if they send an email along?
Yeah, I believe so, and then LenFest has also recorded this, so my understanding is you guys are going to post the recording as well.
Yes, that's correct. So we'll have the full audio and slides, and then it sounds like if you did just want to see the slides, we can make those available as well. Again, a few more questions coming in. Just a reminder, if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A queue there. Next question is more of a policy question, so maybe a bit outside the scope of this work, but I do want to just share with the team here. And the question is, how can you say that U.S. limits are fixed when the scientific and statistical committees of the various councils change the TAC, ACLs, and ACTs almost every year?
I think that's a great point. Do you want to take that, Lisa, SSC Vice Chair?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the TAC is something we're updating, you know, in concert with updates on the stock assessment. And I think what we're, you know, going to be wrestling with is, you know, that the total pie in terms of allocation is changing, certainly with stock abundance, but I think what we're interested in is sort of the conflict with how that's apportioned across space or to different entities within the region. And so certainly the total TAC will be changing, but I think it's that link to how that TAC is allocated to different entities or areas that we're particularly interested in that as a stress point.
And I think, you know, there's a lot of terminology here, and that's one of the things that, you know, we need to, I think, probably be very cognizant of, is being very precise about what we mean when we say allocation, and that it really is this kind of proportional distribution of the access to the resource, not so much the total amount of the resource that's available, which is usually what you would get with the you know, through a stock assessment process.
Great. Okay. Thank you. And while we're waiting for a few more questions to come in, I did just have one question, which is, could you share who you're intending to have join the advisory body, and maybe the types of folks who you're intending to have as part of that group when it comes to thinking about these questions?
Yeah, we've talked to leadership on all three management councils on the East Coast. I'm a little hesitant to share all names yet because we're still assembling that group, and I'm a little bit cautious on that front. We've reached out to a number of industry members who are pretty active in different fisheries and different locations up and down the coast, and I'm still assembling that group and kind of clarifying really the timing of those meetings and the kind of information we're going to be bringing to them and the kinds of feedback that we want, and also trying to understand a little bit better where these conversations are within the region to kind of follow up on that last point about kind of the difference between catch limit setting and allocation setting. They're quite different, and the mechanisms by which those things change are quite different. And so we want to just make sure that we clarify what we're actually talking about, and making sure that the ideas that we bring are going to be additive to the conversations that we're already having. So we'll be finalizing that group in over the next couple of weeks, and we can make those names available. I'm just a little hesitant to do it yet because we haven't firmed them all up yet.
Understood. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for providing some additional context there. As of right now, we actually don't have any other questions in the queue, but let's give it a few minutes here. If folks do have any questions about this project, please feel free to submit them, and we'll just take a few minutes here.
And in case you're wanting another way to engage with this, I know that LendFest, and I believe it's Victoria, is live tweeting this the webinar, which is not quite the Super Bowl, but I think it's also it's fun. And you can also connect with me on Twitter too. I'm at CI_officer.
Great, thank you. Yes, Vicki is doing a phenomenal job of live tweeting this, so thank you, Vicki. And we do have a few other questions that are coming in as well. So let's see. Yep. So next question has to do with the EU, and again, this question is: how do you envision the discard ban in the EU will affect optimal allocation across nations, if at all?
Well, I don't think I have a good answer, and I will certainly have to be looking at that. And I think it's in the EU too, but other countries, especially what comes with ITQ is the regulatory discard, and then that has been that became a serious issue, and then I'm certain that would have the climate change stress would have impact on discarding behavior, things like that. So
And I can imagine it affecting the kind of the efficiency of the system, perhaps some of the markets as well. I'm not quite sure it would impact the allocation questions that are the main topic of this project, but it's certainly something that we need to think through. That's a major change in a lot of fisheries.
Yeah, I think it could be. I mean, I think it could be an interesting topic to explore. Certainly, it forces the fishery to land what's available to them, which is in some sense more aligned with what, so climate shifts have made a certain composition of stocks available to the fishery, and so they're kind of forced to land what's there. And so I think, it's discarding is something to consider with the shifting distributions and how incentives change to discard. I think it's certainly something we could be seeing where you don't, where we could be seeing discard patterns change with shifting distributions, where there isn't the flexibility to accommodate that through quota exchange, or there could be serious costs to landing those particular fish. So I think it is an interesting side effect of, the impact on discards, of the process of shifting distributions.
Great. All right. Our next question is, in the parameters you will be looking at, the governance context is not explicitly identified. How are you thinking about the role of the governmental framework or culture in your analysis?
I think it's not a primary focus of what we're thinking through. It's certainly something that we're cognizant of, I would say. I think we're really trying to think in a fairly trying to what are the general properties that we can identify out of these systems.
Okay. Next we have, noting that you are working with industry leaders along the U.S. East Coast, can you define industry? And specifically, to what degree are you including the recreational fishing community?
Yeah, we are not explicitly including the recreational fishery in this analysis at this point, because most of the fisheries that the group of managers and industry, and by that I mean really the active fishing industry, and we may pull in some major kind of sources, shoreside infrastructure or processing companies if they hold quota, or if they're kind of major drivers for where fish are landed. So we're still working through that, but our focus, I think, is going to be primarily in federal waters, and focused primarily on species that are being allocated to commercial. The blend of kind of the sector allocation between the questions of sector allocation between commercial and rec fishery is not something that we're really planning to cover on this, because it's partly climate, but it's got so many other aspects to it and pieces of it that I think it would really kind of cloud the waters. So that's not something that we're considering in this study.
And I think one other thing to add to that, in the third year of the project, we are planning to have some more open meetings that would be open to different fisheries stakeholders within the region. And I imagine that those, when we've done those in the past at GMRI, we've made an effort to try to include both rec and commercial when appropriate. So I think those voices will be part of the mix. But at least initially, I think we're going to focus more on the commercial side, especially because of the broader goals of the LenFest program and our project, which is to really generalize to these global industrial fisheries.
Great, thanks for the clarification. And we do have another question on the Maori from the New Zealand piece. I'm not sure if this is within the scope of what you're looking at, but it was just a follow-up here, which is, So do Maori receive a group quota or just aggregate their individual quotas as citizens? I had some audio difficulty at the very beginning, so this may have been dealt with.
Do you know?
My understanding is that Maori holds at least half or majority of the quotas that are issued in New Zealand, but there is so the quota in New Zealand can be owned by any citizens, and that means that those who are fishing might not be necessarily the ones who are holding the quota, so they're leasing a quota. So when we talk about the allocation, we should be looking at the allocation at the quota allocation level, and also should be also looking at who is actually using the quota, and that has a serious community consequences. I'm not directly answering the question because this is the fishery that I only recently started looking at, and I really appreciate if anyone who is listening in right now could provide us with information if you have any. And but yeah, we'll keep this question in mind, and moving forward, I'm going to be looking at the details.
Great, thank you, Kanai. And just a reminder to folks, there is this link on this end slide here to the Google form to the survey. If you do want to provide any input that you might be able to collaborate with the folks at GMRI, and of course you can also feel free to email myself or Dr. Pershing. So the next question is, have you reached out to any of the regional management bodies, such as the councils or the commissions, to discuss what has already been completed? For instance, a few years ago, the ASMFC was working on reallocation options through their Management and Science Committee. How much will you be focusing on guidance or recommendations, i.e., it's clear that we're going to need transboundary agreements to deal with some of these stock shifts in the not-too-distant future. Will you be giving any guidance on how to design these?
Yeah, I'll let Lisa chime in too, but yes, we are forming this advisory group from sort of senior members of the councils along the Atlantic seaboard, largely because they have been having these conversations and are deep in trying to understand how shifting species, how they're going to respond to fishing species, both on the management, who's managing them, how you begin to shift or integrate management plans, and how you might address the question of changing allocation along the coast between communities or permit holders or what have you. We are actually still trying to parse out how much to incorporate the way that the Atlantic States Commission operates versus how the federal system operates, just because they're quite different systems. And so we're still trying to tease it. We want to cover a lot of this ground because there's a lot of really rich history and understanding here, but we also don't want to muddy the waters too much in terms of how we ground truth this work. And as you say, both the councils and the commission have been doing work, sometimes separately, sometimes together, over the last several years, and some interesting ideas have come up. And there's some opportunities and there's some barriers. So our inclination is to be more on the federal side, but we're trying to kind of parse that out.
Yeah, this is Lisa. I'll just follow up. I think to the questioner's point, we are aware of the ASMFC effort and their kind of report they produced on, kind of innovative allocation strategies and methods that might be more responsive. And I think certainly we'll draw on the work that's been done regionally and by ASMFC. I think they had some really interesting ideas that they proposed at that time when they got together, thinking about new bases for allocation, thinking about allocating based on biomass, available in a particular region, or thinking about new entities for allocation, and just general different flexible options for allocating quota. So I think it certainly will try to draw on the efforts that have gone on in the region and build from there.
That's
Great questions.
Yeah. There's several more here that we can work through, and the next question here has to do with some assumptions of the study. So, are you going to be assuming that the quota that is to be distributed or allocated is fixed, properly set, and protective of other fish predators?
That's a great question. I think we are trying to, I think, not get into the weeds on how the process of stock assessment and the accuracy of the quotas that are set. I think probably if we were modeling what we're doing, which we're not going to be doing, but as somebody who thinks a lot about models, probably the assumption that we would have would be that the quotas are specified accurately. But we, of course, know that that's not the case. And I think one of the things we are really interested in is what are the different scientific processes that need to be in place to support some of the different allocation mechanisms that are out there, and try and think about, because that gets into very much the feasibility, as you're starting to think about, the scientific capacity of different regions, and the methods that you might need in order to make a fishery successful.
Okay. Our next question, are you going to be assuming that are you planning to include small-scale fisheries in the study too? And if so, how will you deal with limited data availability?
So since we're not doing a quantitative modeling study at this point, we're really focusing on trying to do this high level review. Some of the fisheries that we will deal with, even some here in the Northeast, would be classified as small scale fisheries and have to be assessed with data poor methodologies. So that's definitely part of the mix of what we'll be dealing with. I think we're probably not going to be thinking about more of the sort of autonomous management that might take place in more of a developing country framework. We really are thinking about the large-scale commercial, managed fisheries that are out there.
Also to add, if the quota allocation mechanism or system actually, in some cases, allocate certain portion of the quota to the small-scale developing fisheries. And in those cases, we would be looking at how the quotas are allocated across different kinds of gears or different, how quotas are allocated between the commercial fisheries and the small-scale fisheries as well.
Okay, and we have another question that's related to recreational fishing. It's a little bit different than the one that was asked earlier, which is, are you exploring the impacts of climate change on recreational fishing as well, or exclusively on commercial fishing?
Yeah, I think we've sort of mostly addressed that. I mean, I think the interaction between recreational and commercial in a kind of a climate context is interesting. I don't think it's been explored very well, and there's definitely some opportunities there. I mean, I think especially as you think in the Northeast or on the East Coast, there's definitely a gradient of as you move to the south, move into a more diverse community of fish. You also see a transition from more commercial into an increased prominence of recreational fisheries, and so that's an interesting thing that I think we will probably try to address at some point, but it's not going to be first and foremost on our list.
Okay. Our next question has to do with industry, and could you also speak a little more in detail about how you are gathering information from industry members and how you are selecting industry members to gather information from?
So I think there's several different ways. For the advisory panel, we're trying to keep that a relatively small group, and we're focusing on people who have been pretty engaged in the management process, I think, at least up until now, so that we are dealing with folks who are familiar with the issues or familiar with the conversations that have already happened. And so these are folks that either are serving on councils or are prominent kind of leaders in their industry. And we'll, as I said, we'll be able to kind of roll out those names pretty soon. And then as Andy mentioned, part of later in this process, we'll be running outreach meetings up and down the coast to engage industry and all stakeholders really more deeply in our findings and help inform kind of next steps. And this is something that GMRI does pretty frequently. We do port meetings, we do industry meetings, we work with commercial, recreational industry members, and we'll be following a lot of those protocols, getting meeting notices out and having pretty well facilitated meetings and taking notes and having them recorded and allowing for a variety of ways of input and feedback. And I think that through that process, we're hoping to uncover, particularly in this region, some real key issues and key kind of tipping points and turning points in these species and these decisions that can help then reorient our research to find examples that might help figure out a pathway forward for the specific questions that are coming up for industry here.
Okay. Our next question is, I see that you are seeking to identify allocation challenges as stocks shift. Do you expect to make stock management recommendations based on your findings?
I would say that we are not planning to say go into a fishery in some place and say that species X should shift from being managed and having an allocation in one way and proposing that they be switched to another. I think more what we have in mind is that as fisheries through their normal process of updating their management, as they are thinking about the allocations in their fishery, we feel like there's a need to have this toolkit out there that would help them evaluate different options and be able to sort of pick and choose the one that is going to be right for them, knowing that there are multiple dimensions that they're trying to address: the conservation goals, the economic goals, and the social and cultural goals that they might have for their fisheries.
Okay. Our next question is in terms of thinking about how allocations are decided in the first place. So historical catch has been the golden currency when it comes to allocation disputes between recreational and commercial. However, one group can be constrained by a permit moratorium while another group grows exponentially. So what other metrics can managers look at that help solve these issues?
That's a great question. I mean, and that's one of the challenges of these historical-based systems is that that there are various ways that they can get I mean, I'm going to use the term manipulated, and I don't necessarily mean that in an active way, but where once you decide that you're going to measure something in one way, it can have these side effects. And we're not so much interested in those side effects, but thinking more about what are the side effects that you get as history confronts a changing ocean. And I think that's really what we're after.
And another thing that has been pointed out is that when you base your initial allocation on the historical catch, then you're essentially punishing those who might be more conservationist in the past in hopes of them protecting their resources. Then, if you're conserving more in the past, they might not be allocated the fair share of the quota. And those are the things, the side effects of that historical catch-based allocation. And that's the kind of side effects that we're going to be looking at. And also, when you think about one sector fishing activities going through the moratorium while the other fisheries going through the exponential growth, there is certainly a challenge of the available data for both of those sectors. And I think what are the kind of information that is needed to be able to support the fair, I don't know if I should use the term fair, but what would be the proper allocation policy would be. We're going to be hopefully finding out how science can support in achieving those goals.
Okay, our next question is fairly straightforward. Will the review explore the interactions between adjacent management bodies?
I think that is very much something that we're interested in, and I think we're really interested in how that interaction changes based on the kind of the governance or the management structures that have been in place. So how is that different in an international context versus in a domestic context? How is that different if you have a fishery that then has a quota managed system where quota can be traded versus another system like the EU example that Kanai mentioned, where the allocation is really assigned geographically, even if the fishermen are allowed to fish in other areas.
Great, and then kind of going off of that same idea about international management bodies, do you think the U.S. has an advantage in adapting to climate change because all of the councils are under the same legal mandate, that being Madison-Stevens Act?
That is a fantastic question. I mean, I think yeah, in some ways yes, but I think every system is going to have some side effects. I think right now in Magnuson, the different councils each have a particular culture that they've developed. They have a particular way that they've managed those fisheries. Some of them are really thinking deeply about climate change. Others are, this hasn't become an issue for them or for their stakeholders. So I think in theory, I think the U.S. has, might have some advantages over other areas, but I think it's one of the things we're hoping to really understand.
Okay, our next question. Will you be exploring incentives for changing quota allocations for regions that are, quote unquote, losing traditional stocks?
Absolutely.
Says our economist.
Yes, we're looking at those cases as well. And if you know any cases like that, please let us know.
Okay, our next question. The question is, interested to know if you will document the best cases of which jurisdictions or entities are managing these transitions well.
Like I said, it's like the Super Bowl. We're going to be keeping rigorous score and declaring, no, we're not going to be doing that necessarily, but I think we will be on the lookout for examples in case studies where things have really gone wrong, or where a fishery is really exposed perhaps a novel kind of climate stress. I think we'll also be looking for examples where a fishery has sort of embraced perhaps a new idea that might provide some insight.
Yeah, and just to follow up, I think the important thing there is really characterizing, if there was a particular success, what were the circumstances and the characteristics of the system, and, kind of communicating that not every scheme would have the same effectiveness, in every area or governance structure.
Great. And we just have a few more minutes here, and we have a lot more questions in the queue, so I think we're going to do 2 more questions, and then if your question wasn't addressed today, feel free to email me or to email Dr. Pershing, and we can be happy to continue that dialogue. We've also been keeping track of folks who have submitted comments as well to pass along to the research team. So last couple of questions here. First off, has anyone allocated using something other than landings data? I imagine maybe something like fishing mortality.
Zonal attachment or the allocation based on the actual abundance of the stocks in different management areas, I think would come to my mind as an example.
Got it. Great. And our last question today is, have you or are you planning on reaching out to the U.S. West Coast councils and states as well as folks on the East Coast?
We we definitely thought about doing that as we were putting together this project. And as always, there's sort of a balance between breadth versus depth. And what we decided for this project to do was to go broad with the initial review, and then go deep within the region where we're based, and where we have, I think, connections that we can lean on, and we have a little bit more granular knowledge of the fisheries. With that said, we're everybody on the team has we go to conferences. We're involved in the we have colleagues in these regions in the U.S. and around the world, and so this isn't something that we're not going to talk to people from the other coasts, but we're not going to necessarily be giving them the same level of outreach and engagement that we're going to be doing here in the Northeast.
Okay, Dr. Pershing, thanks so much for that clarification. I think we're going to wrap up questions there. Again, we have several more in the queue, and if you do want to continue the dialogue, please feel free to shoot myself or Dr. Pershing an email. Also, for folks who do have any case studies they'd like to share, please check out the survey that I mentioned earlier, and the link is here on the page right now. And with that, I think we'd again like to thank so much our folks at the Gulf Maine Research Institute for this great presentation and great discussion around allocation under climate change. And if you do like some more information, again, please feel free to email myself or Dr. Pershing. And if you'd like more information on the LenFest Ocean program, pay us a visit at lenfestocean.org, where you can also sign up for our newsletter. And feel free to follow us at LenFestOcean on Twitter. And so with that, I think we are all set. Thank you all so much again for joining, and please feel free to follow up with any further questions. Take care.
Thank you very much.